Ulysses S. Grant was born Hiram Ulysses Grant at Pleasant Point, Ohio in 1822. His father's name was Jesse Grant, a local man who ran a tannery. Grant grew up the oldest son of Jesse and Hannah Grant and worked in his father's tanning yard, though Grant hated working there, and this led to Grant's dislike of raw meat.
When he grew up, his dad had a tannery right there at the residence in Ohio. Being around the bloody, reeking hides and everything, tanning hides into leather was kind of a dirty, miserable job. He didn't have any use for that. He didn't, the business made him sick.
Growing up in Ohio on a farm allowed Grant to work with horses. His love for horses followed him throughout his life. Did you know Grant became so good at breaking horses that many local farmers often came to him when they received new horses? At the age of 17, Grant was accepted into West Point Military Academy thanks to his father's influence. Before his arrival at West Point, Grant stopped in New York, where a misprint in his papers changed his name to Ulysses S. Grant. Did you know that upon graduating West Point, Grant wanted to return and teach math? He never planned on having a military career. Following his graduation at West Point, Grant met the woman he would marry. In 1844, Ulysses S. Grant met Julia Dent and began to court her. Before they could be married, the Mexican War started, and the Dent-Grant wedding had to be postponed for 4 years. Did you know that during the Mexican War, Grant was present at every battle except for Buena Vista? After the Mexican War, Ulysses and Julia moved to St. Louis, where they stayed until their eventual move to Galena, Illinois. Though the move was more out of necessity rather than want, as explained by Steve Repp, a local historian.
When Ulysses Grant had resigned from the Army in 1854 and had settled near St. Louis and was living there with his wife's family, fallen on hard times, in the late 1850s, there was a depression. Ulysses' health had broke down a little bit. He couldn't do a lot of the farming stuff that he was doing, and it was kind of very hard exertion, and so he retired from that business and doing that. And
upon the move to Galena, Ulysses began to work at his father's leather store, which is currently Galena Bears. While working at the leather store, Grant's bosses were his younger brothers Orville and Samuel. Though Grant soon became used to the rhythmic and often repetitive work in Galena, and he longed for change.
Went to visit his father, Jesse Grant, and what happened is it was suggested that maybe he could come to the store in Galena and work there for a while and help out with the business until something else turned up in his favor. Here he is working in the store a year before the outbreak of the Civil War. He really wasn't that well known in town.
Fate would change Grant's career. In 1861, only 11 months after the Grant family moved to Galena, Fort Sumter was fired upon. Grant, sympathizing with the Union cause, rode to Springfield and began to train troops there, though Grant only stayed in the lower-ranking positions until someone realized his ability.
And Abraham Lincoln, he needed a general that could win the war, and he was having a hard time finding one until U.S. Grant came along. And Abraham Lincoln, as our president, realized that this was the man. He finally came to the realization that this was the man, U.S. Grant, that was going to end this war.
Grant won many key battles in the Civil War, including Vicksburg and Fort Donelson, though perhaps the most famous victory by Grant is General Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in 1865.
Fame came to him with the Civil War, and he comes back to Galena after the war, one of the most famous people in the country. What a celebration. Here's a guy that leaves at the beginning of the Civil War and hardly anyone knows him. And then, with the fame that came to him with the Civil War, of course everybody knew him. Probably, they say, newspaper reports have said somewhere in the area of 20,000 people came in on Galena to join in the celebration.
With Grant's newfound fame also came responsibility. After the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in 1866, Ulysses Grant became the forerunner of the Republican Party. It was local members of the Galena Republicans who purchased Grant a gift upon his arrival home. The Grants had been living in a home for rent on High Street for $100 a month. The Republicans purchased Grant a home for $2,500 and presented it to the Grants in November. This home still bears the Grants mark today.
I think there were people that believed in his cause for the presidency.
It was those same Republicans who helped choose Grant to be the Republican candidate. Mr. Repp recalls the night of the election according to his research.
Right. A special telegraph had been hooked up in the library. A special telegrapher was brought in from Chicago to decipher all the messages of the election returns. So on the night of the election, here comes U.S. Grant down to the Washburn house to get the election returns. Congressman Washburn, the congressman from this district for a number of years, felt it would be pretty nice to, we got a whole group of him and his friends could hear the election returns as the states came in, hopefully for U.S. Grant, and they did. And so, into the library, it must have been an interesting scene to hear the telegraph tapping out those little messages and somebody deciphering all of that and saying that Pennsylvania, New York, and the different states had gone for U.S. Grant. So it was actually in that room that he heard the news that he became the 18th president.
It is often said of Grant's presidency that he was president during one of the toughest times in our country, though a lot of good was done while Grant was in office.
He was very kind of a shy, bashful person. His speeches really were not his forte, kind of.
Near the end of his second term, Grant's only daughter Nellie was married to an Englishman. This marriage sparked the eventual 2-year tour of the Grants.
But while president, he visited Galena twice. He was here in 1871, 1873, both visits just for a few days. After his presidency, he came back for a short visit in 1877. And then in 1879, he went on a world tour.
Grant's tour was originally supposed to only last a few months and only span in Europe, though due to Grant's popularity, instead the tour lasted for 2 years and encased the globe. Some of the countries Grant visited included Belgium, Japan, and Mexico.
What they did is they went to England, and they thought, they'd probably travel around Europe a little bit, but I don't believe they thought it would turn out like it did, because wherever he went, people turned out, kings and queens and working class people of all different classes, wanting to see this famous general and president of the United States.
Following the world tour, Grant moved with his family to New York. Grant and his wife Julia stayed in New York. Near the end of his life, Grant began to write his memoirs and was diagnosed with throat cancer.
Eventually, U.S. Grant got to the business of writing his memoirs, his life story, and a fellow by the name of Mark Twain helped publish them, and they became a bestseller. In the meantime, while he was starting to write his memoirs, he was diagnosed as having throat cancer, and so he was in a lot of pain, but he was determined to finish his memoirs, and that he did, and he finished them a few weeks before he died.
Ulysses S. Grant died July 23, 1885. He was survived by his wife Julia, his sons Frederick, Jesse, and Ulysses S. Grant Jr., and his daughter Nellie. In 1902, Julia Grant died, and following her death, the Grant home was given to the city of Galena by the Grant children, and today Grant Park in Galena becomes a place for hundreds of Boy Scout troops to celebrate Grant's life. Julia Grant now has a statue located near the Grant home, one of 4 First Lady statues in the country. Throughout his life, Ulysses Grant touched many people, and he will always be remembered in this small town of Galena, Illinois.
In some ways, if you look at him, he's really a role model for people to continue on despite how bad things might be, to continue on to the end and see it through.